favorite things to do is spend an afternoon reading a fantasy adventure story where there's a quest to save a world full of dragons, magic, and otherworldly beings. I've enjoyed this genre for a very long time. In fact, I vividly remember in middle school, a group of boys who spent every lunch hour playing Dungeons and Dragons, a fantasy game where players reenacted the types of stories I love to read. I thought it looked really cool. I would have loved to ask to join them, but I never did. My girlfriends were obsessed with the teenage drama in the Sweet Valley High series, and that was the only girl I knew who read about dragons, so I figured it was a boy thing. Now, had I connected with those kids who shared my interests I've had now for a lifetime, I'm sure I would have made new friends. I might have lost some, but more importantly, I would have had the experience of acting on what was important to me as a kid, as opposed to what was expected of me as an American girl. 6 years ago, I moved to Bergamo with my Italian husband, Francesco. Sorry. It's the children, my children, Paolo, Isabel, and Chiara. And since then, I've been trying to understand what is expected of an Italian girl, and how might those expectations help us understand why there are so few women in leadership in Italy. Today, I'll share some of what I learned, and I'd like to start with a story. It's the late 1800s in Rome. The Italian Republic is decades old and has just turned to the question of how to educate its citizens. Our heroine, Maria, is one of the lucky few with parents who are willing and able to send her to elementary school. After, she wanted to go on to the technical high school. Now, there wasn't a rule that said she couldn't go, but everybody knew that that was a school meant for boys. Well, with her mother's help, she did enroll in this school meant for boys, and that was her first victory over the status quo. She would go on to become the very first Italian woman to obtain a medical degree, and then as Dr. Montessori, she would revolutionize education around the globe by challenging the idea that adults and kids learn in the same way. This is a story about how a girl becomes a leader, and our kids need to hear these stories because leadership is a 21st century skill they will need to develop in a world where many of today's elementary school kids will be applying for jobs as adults that haven't even been invented yet. We know from the research that leaders are made, not born. Intelligence, being an extrovert, or even being the boss doesn't make you a leader. Yet there is this idea about who should lead. In an experiment that's been conducted in many countries, men and women are asked to draw a picture of an effective leader. They almost always draw a man. Leaders may not be born, but the global prototype of a leader is a man, and it influences things like who we see as even having the potential to lead. In another study, participants were asked to watch a team meeting and rate the leadership potential of the team leader. Men and women read the same inspiring words meant to motivate the team, and the men were seen as having leadership potential, and the women were not seen as leaders at all. Results like these, among others, are, to put it mildly, deeply disappointing. 50 years ago, in many countries, the rules began to change. Doors were open for women in education and the workforce. Back then, people thought it was only a matter of time until we achieved gender equity in leadership. Turns out that changing the rules is a good start, but not nearly enough. In 2015, the OECD found that globally, women held less than 20% of executive level positions and 12% of board seats in the private sector. In government, just 35% of the highest level civil servants were women. And Italy comes in last, or close to last, in many gender equity rankings. In 2019, in a study of European nations, Italy came in last in terms of gender equity at work. In another, researchers asked the question, how likely was it that a girl would make it to a position of leadership in 100 different countries? Italy came in 97th. To better understand the stories behind these numbers, I interviewed 50 Italian women and asked them about their educational and their career paths. Today, I'd like to share 2 observations. Observation number 1, ambitions are curbed early on. When I asked my interviewees how they chose their high school or their university, many said that they were strongly advised to choose a career that would give them the time they would need in the future to care for their children. Or they were told it simply didn't matter what they studied because their future husband would care for their family financially anyway. Girls are being told as early as middle school that their interests, their ambition is secondary at best to their primary role as caretaker. And the girls are listening. Italy has one of the highest rates of gender segregation in education in Europe. Girls are tracked to study humanities, education, health and welfare, and most of the students in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics are boys. Now, I know some of you are thinking that is just because boys and girls naturally like those subjects. If that were the case, then how could it be that 1/3 of European nations are heading towards a completely integrated educational system? It's not biology, it's culture. And this gender segregation in education becomes the same in the workforce. Italy, again, has one of the highest rates of gender segregation in the workforce, which leads to gender inequity in career development and salaries and much more. Kids need to be encouraged to strive for a future that's right for them individually, as opposed to one that's been designed for a boy or a girl. Observation number 2, preparation will get you only so far. Who has heard of Rosina Ferrario? In 1913, she became the first Italian woman to obtain a license to fly. In the early 1900s, aviation was new and so dangerous that aviators were seen as daredevils. Women were, of course, discouraged from learning to fly by many, and Rosina ignored them all and enrolled in flight school anyway. The day she got her license, she was instantly famous, on the covers of magazines, and soon nicknamed by fans and journalists alike, the fearless aviator. She flew for 18 months. When Italy joined World War I, all civilian flights were grounded, and so was Rosina. She wrote to the military and the Red Cross to ask to offer her services, and they both politely refused, citing obvious reasons, and suggested she go home to support the war. I heard a version of Rosina's story in so many of my interviews. Women who studied, who worked hard, who were committed, but eventually arrived at some place in their career where they did not belong. They were not welcome, and some were asked to go home. In 2019, Italy came in last among European nations in terms of women's participation at work, with, on average, Italian women working more part-time jobs, which means less career development usually, and leaving the workforce earlier than women in every other European nation. If we want women to be able to develop their full potential, we have to, at the very least, ensure that they are starting on an educational path that's aligned with their ambitions and that we don't push them out mid-career. Now, I asked my interviewees, what can we do to change the situation? And many pointed to a culture that narrowly defines what a woman should or shouldn't do. Now, one way to think about culture is that it's like water is to fish, essential everywhere, and invisible to the fish themselves. So as someone who sits outside the fishbowl of Italian culture, I'd like to offer 2 cultural messages I've seen that I think are holding Italian girls back. Message number 1, Italian women don't lead. In 2017, I co-founded the Creative Leadership Foundation, and our first program was a leadership development workshop for middle school girls. 200 girls attended our workshop in the first year, and this is what we noticed. In one activity, the girls are divided into groups and asked to list 10 famous people outside of sports or entertainment. One group does a global list, and one group does an Italian list. The global list has almost always 2 to 3 women on it, and the Italian list is almost always all men. When we asked the girls, why was the Italian list all men, they quickly, and without hesitation, will tell us some version of, because girls don't want, are not supposed to, or are not allowed to lead? There's one answer that really stayed with me, because women's opinions don't count. The girls had never heard of women in leadership and Italian women in leadership, and they had gotten the message that Italian women were not meant to lead. And it's a message that's really not hard to find. In my son's history book from the local public middle school, there was only one Italian woman listed, and they didn't even really do her justice. Matilde di Canossa was a feudal lord, powerful feudal lord from the Middle Ages, who outwit an emperor on the battlefield and was crowned vice queen of Italy at the end of her long life, among many other things. The history book focused on her role as a hostess. She hosted a pope and an emperor in her castle for an important negotiation between the two of them. If kids don't hear about, our second initiative at the foundation was to tell some stories of Italian women who have led through history. And we did it in a book for middle school kids. If kids don't know about these women, among other women, we are showing them a world where Italian women don't lead. I will say this, though. The girls also couldn't think of men as preschool teachers. In another activity, we asked the girls to draw a picture of a scientist or preschool teacher in a preschool teacher. The preschool teacher was a woman, and the scientist was a man, again and again and again. When we asked the girls what would happen if a 10-year-old boy said, "I want to be a preschool teacher," the answer was always the same: ridicule. If we would like kids learn their roles early on, they know what is okay to like and not like, and this shapes their actions, which shapes their future. Cultural message number 2. Leadership is masculine. After we'd been giving the workshop for a couple months, we got some feedback that parents didn't want to send their girls to a leadership workshop. One reason we discovered is that the word leader has literally been lost in translation. If you look up the word leader in English, it means someone who leads. To lead is to innovate, to inspire, to show the way. But leader, translated into Italian, is capo, or boss. Most Italians will tell you that capo is command, order, and control. This might explain the parents' reluctance. A command and control leadership style comes from military organizations and is often seen as masculine. Leadership isn't masculine or feminine. It is about inspiration, inspiring people to achieve for something greater than themselves, a shared vision. It is about challenging the status quo and working towards a world that does not yet exist. If we want a world, one that does not exist today, where girls and boys have an equal shot at leadership or becoming a scientist or a preschool teacher, we're going to have to do much more than change the rules. Our kids, our grandkids, our nieces and nephews, our students, how they see the world and their role in it is up to us. So I'd like to end with an invitation. I'd like to invite you to put aside those messages you've learned about what a boy and a girl should do and listen to the kids in your lives for their heart's ambition. What do they really want to do? And when that ambition is different from what's expected of a girl or a boy, support them in doing it anyway. They will need your help. Once we all start doing that, we will be opening the doors to the Dr. Montessori's, the Rosina Ferrarios, and the Matilde di Canossas of the future. We will be making a world where every kid has a chance to become their best self. Wouldn't that be amazing? Thank you. Thank you very much.